east, the Mayacamas Hills to the west, and you have the valley that sits in between, about 30 miles in length. And here we are. We just went past it, but yeah, I got it. Thanks. So yes, the Mayacamas Range, the Vaca Mountains. The main artery is Highway 29, of course, you all know that, and then of course some trail to the east. And of course the vegetation here is more scrub oak. Here you have, on the west facing side of the Mayacamas Mountains, you have more vegetation, much more vegetation, and even large trees. So you have firs and redwoods sitting along this side of the Mayacamas Mountains. And the obvious reasons are the storms, again, are when we get rain, they're moving in this direction, so these mountains tend to get more rainfall than the Vaca Range, squeezing a little more water out here before, but also probably the more important is this side gets the hot western sun. So, and this side is protected from the sun during the afternoon. So if there's valley fog, these trees will get some of the benefit from the fog, so this is cooler as well as protected from the afternoon sun. There's a choke point that's really important. You can see this small, between Oakville and Yountville, the Yountville Hills. And right in this area, as you pass Yountville, you're quite familiar that you have to make a bit of a jog to get around the mountains. This choke point is like, you know, the narrowing of the hourglass. So the cold air that's moving up valley from San Pablo Bay is moving up quite comfortably, but when it gets here, it gets blocked or partially blocked. So then it just streams in lightly. So when I was working at Mondavi back in the late 70s and early 80s, leaving at 6 o'clock at night and driving past these hills, 10 degrees temperature drop, just like that. So it's like, wow, that's impressive. And you don't see that in a lot of parts of the world. If you're back on the East Coast, or actually in Argentina, there's very few places where you see, as we have here in California, such dramatic temperature changes in short distances. So we really have to be mindful of that, or how we're going to work. We have Dr. Crane, and well, these are the three Beckstoffer locations. This is Oakville, and Tocolon, Dr. Crane, and Las Piedras are quite close together. And so I believe in your fourth class, you have Dr. Crane. By the way, I was just there late yesterday around 6 o'clock because we're in the process now of doing the final thinning of the vineyard fruit separation and green thinning to make sure that all the laggards, all the clusters that would be a little further behind have been removed. So that's what's happening currently in the vineyard. This is just a quick AVA map so you can see how they're stacked. There's 20 or 17, I'm sorry. The newest being Crystal Springs. That was just, I think, last year. And Coonsville preceded it in 2011. But when I started in the business back in the late 70s, there was only one AVA, that was Napa Valley. So you have the first AVAs being named in 1983, Carneros and Hall Mountain. And now there's a total of 17. Very quickly, also prices have changed. No surprise to anyone here. When I started at Mondavi full time, the price was $500 a ton for Cabernet Sauvignon. Average in 2023 was about $9,000. So a significant change over a short period of time. Also, look at the acres planted. 5,500 acres back, and let's say make this a nice even number. 1980, 5 times more acreage of Cabernet planted from 1980 to, let's say, 2020, 40 years later. So a huge increase there. And the main changes, look at, we were flat through 1980, but beginning in the decade in the 90s was the massive growth. And you can say, well, why? Why all of a sudden in Napa Valley sort of like, boom, go with Cabernet? Judgment of Paris, 76, I think, was prelude, followed by Mouton's sort of like, you might say, coronation of California by forming a partnership with Robert Mondavi. Opus 1 was another, essentially, the French saying, yes, this region, indirectly or directly, we think must validate Mr. Mondavi's argument that Cabernet in Napa Valley is world class, and we can compete with the best of the world. And then, of course, one other major influence, and maybe apart from all those other ones, just as influential, in the name of one critic, you all know, Robert Parker. So remember, Parker came out with a prediction in the early 1980s that Bordeaux was, many people said was a poor vintage. Well, he said it was a great vintage. It proved to be a great vintage, which cemented his reputation. And so his power particularly began to build in the 90s, and really by the 90s and 2000s, Parker's voice was predominant. If Parker gave you a high score, your life was easy. And so winemakers were trying to do their best to make wines that would please Mr. Parker. Here you can see the comparison between Napa Valley price and 1980. Well, Sonoma's still kind of struggling to find out how much to charge. They didn't have except no history of price on Cabernet and Sonoma in 1980. But here in recent years, you have 9,000, as we mentioned, 1/3 the price for Sonoma Cabernet. So quite a difference between the two places. You can imagine there's some opportunity for Sonoma with lower priced fruit that can be just as good. James Lobby with the Wine Spectator tried to promote that idea. I don't think Sonoma has ever taken it so seriously, but we have a vineyard, for example, in the Alexander Valley, and I'm thinking the quality off of that vineyard is as good as some of the best fruit that we're working with in Napa. But now it's like, well, how do we get it to be known? So perception. Cabernet. This is what I fight to get my growers to do, like the Beckstoffer boys, is like, I want good separation of clusters. Very important, because this variety has a compound called methoxypyrazines. If it's too green, not many people like that characteristic of bell pepper. So getting the right balance, Cabernet being a cross. The French, by the way, argue that this is a naturally made cross between Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc as the father. They say they didn't, I've asked this question multiple times, how did it come to be? And they said, well, it just happened in the vineyard. There was a Sauvignon Blanc sitting next to a Cabernet Franc, and they came together to form Cabernet Sauvignon. So they say they didn't create it. I don't know, I have to go with what they say. But there should be a little herbal element, in my opinion, of a great Cabernet. It should be subtle, but it should be there. That could be like graphite, a little bit of tobacco or cedar that's contributed by the oak. We're looking here at good lignification of the cane, of the peduncle, and also the rachis. You notice the architecture of a high quality cluster is also loose, so you can see light through the cluster itself. If you add too much water or too many nutrients, it bloats and fills, and you won't be able to see through, as you can see through here. So that's what we're looking for. You see a little bit of yellowing in the leaf canopy. That's the senescence we're looking for. The grapes are about ready to pick. You don't need a refractometer to understand this. And of course, in the old days, we had, if we were putting the leaves on a sorting table, or I should say the cluster on a sort table, this bin would be full of leaves. Now we finally trained all the harvesters, no leaves. You can take them out later, maybe you can get some, but we want it very clean. And again, you have this sort of like blueberries. This is how we would gravity feed to the tank. Here you have the fermentation curve. This is the cold soak. Basically, fruit came in at 56 degrees, or let's say 55 degrees, held here. We actually just hold the temperature here. On the 6th day, we release, and the temperature immediately shoots up because we have the initiation of fermentation, which generates a lot of heat. And then you have essentially, well, this yellow curve is alcohol increasing up to about 14.5%. And we're dropping the temperature slowly as fermentation progresses to slow down to have a more gentle extraction. So we start very warm when fermentation initiates, and then we go to cool it down. The graph doesn't make it look like much is happening here. We cruise along here at the 90s, and then on the 11th day, we're seeing it slowly drop down. So by that point, we've consumed a significant amount of sugar. The red is the sugar curve. And finally, we're basically close to dryness around the 2 weeks from the time of destemming and crushing. Here we're adding air. In the many years, the early years of my career, making wine, red wine in particular, but Cabernet, that when you were in the cellar, it always smelled like rotten eggs. The reason for that is because there was late application of sulfur dioxide, or elemental sulfur to fight mildew in the vineyard. Today we have much better farming, so the amount of elemental sulfur that's applied to fight mildew in a vineyard is very, very small. And we finish usually by the early part of July, and the harvest doesn't happen until late September or October, so all the sulfur is gone. But I can remember walking into the vineyard not that many years ago, and you're touching the vine, and you come home and you reek of sulfur, your car smells of sulfur, and today it's just a whole much better process. It's not just for us. I think a lot of people learned how to farm much better. So in the early years, we did this aeration to blow off the rotten egg smell. But today it's very clean. If you come and smell during the fermentation, there's fresh fruit, which is what, of course you want. So why are we doing this? To add oxygen so the yeast can build cell wall. But then fermentation is anaerobic. So we're adding air, the yeast consume the oxygen, build a cell wall, and then they go anaerobic. That's the only way you're gonna have fermentation, is in an anaerobic environment. All right, so Las Piedras and Dr. Crane, this is St. Helena. We are up against the Mayacamas range. This is Dr. Crane here. Well, Dr. Belden Crane, let me go back to that real quick. I should give him Dr. George. Dr. George is credited with being the first to plant Cabernet Sauvignon at this particular vineyard in the Napa Valley, according to the literature that we found in the St. Helena Library. So that's his claim to fame. So he's got some roads or streets, a park, and so on and so forth, and now a vineyard named after him. This is a 20-acre vineyard. You can see Mount St. John, so just over here with the Opus One and Robert Mondavi Winery. And we are about 3 miles north of this mountain and looking at the Mayacamas Mountains. The vineyard has 3 main sections. We harvest from 2. I'm very particular where I take from the vineyard. It's like, assume that this vineyard is like a cow. When you buy a cow, you say, okay, where's my best cuts? So I look at it the same way. I look at this vineyard and say, okay, I'm a butcher. Where am I going to find the best cuts in the vineyard? So I'm avoiding this area that's near this gravel pit. This is a very vigorous block B, so I stay away from B altogether. That was an easy one. Here, too much gravel, so the vines are struggling. You can see all the misses. High tension lines here, so I avoid that, and avoid the road down here. So I'm taking slices for the vineyard from walking it and understanding where the soil is the best quality, avoiding any kind of industrial area or the road itself, which can cause pollution and things of that nature. So the 21 vintage is a classic vintage. meaning that was a great vintage. And here, with the Beckstoffer selections, there's only 2 clones. One is a Davis selection, clone 4. One is an Intop selection, 337 from France. It's 100% cab. And you can see, normally, it picks fairly early because this is a warm site. Even though it's protected in the late afternoon, yesterday, for example, it reached 87 degrees, which is pretty warm on what was the coolest day of this week. So it has no problem climbing to 100 degrees. And one thing is, the biggest concern is that it doesn't get to 110 or 115 degrees. It tends to lean more toward red fruit. So when you compare this to the next wine, which is Nathan Coombs, and that, let me check one thing. Also 21 vintage. This map helps you see where the Coombsville area is located. This map, in addition to being a relief map, a topographical relief map, shows you essentially, at least the person that did this map, their interpretation of the temperature zones. So the Carneros being the coolest or bluest color, a little warmer up valley until you get to Oakville, quite warm, Stag's Leap, basically quite similar to Coombsville in terms of temperature. So airflow is from the San Pablo Bay, and this is the northern direction like so. This is the rim of an extinct volcano, also known as a caldera. You have the center part of the volcano here, where the southernmost vineyard, and this little bit of mountain range here is a state park called Skyline. Blocks cool air that's coming in. So we get cool air moving up like this. It would be blocked by these mountains, so we're protected. But some of that cool air bleeds in, which is what we want. We want it to bleed in. We're not exposed to the high winds that you would get, for example, in Carneros, because Carneros has nothing but the bay in front of it, so there's no protection from the winds, and you know how strong they can be. So again, this actually was first planted in the 1870s, but it's a little, I should mention, this region has not been well explored. Up Valley vineyards, and most people that come to the Napa Valley travel, well, virtually unless you come in by helicopter or plane, and now you can't fly a helicopter and land it in Napa Valley. So yeah, you come on Highway 29, that's your only route in. Once you get past the city of Napa, you can break over to the Silverado Trail here. Coombsville is just tucked away in the corner, so many of the Up Valley wineries hardly even knew it was there. We worked with a little Coombsville fruit from Tom Farella in the years that I was at Mondavi, and we used it to give lift to the Up Valley fruit because it was fresher and darker in color. So it was a nice blending component. But otherwise, that was all that was going on. So that's why I think it's been a region that's sort of newly discovered, even though it's right under the nose of everyone there. Here you can see sort of what was formerly the center of the volcano, this small grouping of hills. Kongsgard is just back up in here. This is Faust right here. And then our vineyard begins right at this line here, and we have the reservoir and everything this direction. You're looking at about 68 acres planted, and you notice the crowning of these sites. This is actually southern or north facing, this is south facing, this goes down pretty steep, and that is also facing north. And from here, if you're standing here, you can see Mount St. Helena capping the Napa Valley, about, well, let's say 28 miles away. So all this here was formerly planted, these blocks here and these blocks here, not this one, was formerly planted to Merlot. So the people that developed this vineyard were two gentlemen, Bill Hill and Bob Wallach, formed a company called Premier Pacific Vineyards to produce grapes for growers or wineries like me, small guys that didn't have their own vineyards or their own estates. And they were thinking that's a nice business model because there were a lot of small, particularly in the 90s and in the 2000 decade, small producers, big wineries and big growers like Beckstoffer, for example, were gobbling up all the land. So they thought, well, this would be a good business model. They developed this thing, they put in an intense infrastructure. Look at what we call the Pentagon here is a huge reservoir. High density planting, this is less than 6 feet between rows and only 3 feet between the vines. So that's a very high density planting by Napa Valley standards. But they made one mistake. They said this area is too cold to ripen Cabernet Sauvignon, so we're going to plant Merlot. And shortly after they did that, Sideways came out. Hence they had a problem with their business model. Finally forcing them to have to sell because they were only, with all that Merlot, Kendall Jackson was the buyer and that wasn't their target, to pay $600 a ton. So they were losing money on this enormous investment. So that's how this came available in 2012. I purchased this in a way, you know, if you can imagine, maybe some of you have been faced with this situation, is this property was sold on a blind bidding process. In other words, to get into the final round, you had one of 3 bidders was going to get into the final round. So the first round, and then the second round. And you don't know who your competition is or what they're bidding. And they're very good at keeping it, you know, under wraps. Even today, after winning the bid, I still don't know who are my competitors. Nobody has said a word yet. I'm hoping that someone will figure out, you know, who are the guys. But it's a nerve-wracking and nail-biting kind of situation when you're faced with a situation that you have no idea. But in the end, we bought it, and I was like shocked because I was thinking, okay, all it takes is a big boy up valley come in, and they can easily outbid us or outbid me. But somehow they didn't know about it, and this was one of their first properties that they put on the auction stand, so a lot of people hadn't heard about it. And that's how I got lucky to be able to buy a property in the Napa Valley. Today, we've made many changes to the vineyard since I purchased in December of 2012, but they had the foresight of planting this section over here to Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot. They planted Merlot here, and they had nothing planted here. I tried planting Malbec from one of the heritage clones called Marchiori from Argentina, but it never produced grapes, so finally, well, it had the most beautiful plants, but no fruit. For 3 years, nothing. Wow. So I finally gave up and planted Merlot here. And then we also planted this section. So some of this vineyard they hadn't planted it out. So we finished the planting out of the vineyard, and this is what it looks like today. It has several clones of Cabernet, 169, C selection, which some of you may know as Mrs. C's Candy was a good friend with Walt Disney's widow, and the two of them came together to form this new clone. It's really a ripening selection that I also got from the High Vineyard. And others. Much of the vineyard is on a rootstock called 110R. It's an American French cross that does very well in rocky soils. Soils map, of course, this was done originally by the USGS in the 50s, but of course, when we bought the vineyard, we went and we had this redone with lots of soil pits all over the place, remapping the site, only to find out that we didn't need to do it because these guys had it right. That was a big waste of money, but it was confirmation. Fortunately, this is what's called the Gwinnett Rock outcrop, this little area here. That's not where you want to plant grapes. We had to give up. That's why this little corner today is just, we said, okay, we're just going to plant some trees, some oak trees, and we'll see if they can, but it basically is a huge slab of rock. That's why it's called an outcrop. And the best soils are the green and blue, but even these are thinner soils on the red soil here. So those are the earliest ripening grapes on the vineyard. And here you go. I mean, this doesn't tell the full soil profile, but on a vineyard this size, with this many different undulations, you get a lot of different soils. So we recently dug pits again just to see what the soil looks like. Most of it is this igneous rock. You can see it's pocked. It's very heavy. It feels like you're picking up basically a huge hunk of iron. And this is quite the opposite. This is volcanic tuff, compacted ash. And you can pick that up and you can write you can use it on the chalkboard. It's very light, and it's just like chalk. And it holds moisture. So we don't want much of that because it can make the vines too vigorous. So we like this guy, this boy, very good for a vineyard, keeps the soil profile open, allows for deep root mining of the soil. So we can see roots that go down more than 10 or 12 feet, and then we give up following them. You'll notice, again, this is 100% Cabernet, and it's from the oldest block, which was planted in 2002, block 5. So these are the main sections, 5C and 5B. Also, these are very high quality sections of the vineyard, as is block 4. So those are the sites that we perceive to be the #1 sites of the vineyard for Cabernet. And here, it's the color, I think, that first catches your eye. So again, for a winemaker, it's like when we don't have to do anything, make an acid adjustment, when the sugar doesn't get too high so we don't have to augment the must. That's always what we want. We want to be able to pick when we think the fruit reaches its peak and not be forced by a climatic event or a weather event. And we want the chemistry at that moment to be well in balance so that it doesn't need acid augmentation, for example, or nutrients. And that's what we can get here. This is in a rain shadow, so we can pick as late as even early in November, and the sugars will never exceed, let's say, 25 bricks. Whereas up valley, we could see 30 bricks or 32 bricks, which is way too high. So in those cases, we'd have to add water it back, or the fermentation would not finish. Notice the color is quite deep. That's again a function of the coolness of the site, as we talked about before. Warmer sites, less color. The grape actually has much more extract than up valley, about 1/3 more, for example, than Dr. Crane. So hence deeper color, but also a little different hue. Also, given the rockiness, these are the up valley sites that we work with are alluvial soils. These are volcanic soils. We do not have any of the 3rd class of soils, which is metamorphic. That does not exist in the Napa Valley. So blackberry, blackcurrant, some red currants as well, huckleberry. Those are kind of notes that I pick up, along with graphite. You can even feel this sort of graphitic aspect to the wine and the palate. And if I look at that rock, I can imagine, I know this sounds weird, but I was a kid once, and I licked rocks. So I have a sense of what a rock tastes like. I actually still, I don't want to say I actually lick a rock today, but, but you know how rocks change, like if they're river rocks, and they have a smell and a flavor. You think that's just an inert, it's dead, right? But it's not. It's got a personality and a character. So I can imagine when I'm tasting the wine, these volcanic rocks expressing themselves through the wine. And I think that's it. Lunch.